Hey guys, I'm Tim with Tim Heron Shooting, and today I wanted to talk about doing a trigger job on your AceXR VR controller. It's pretty simple on how to pull this apart, and in order to do a trigger job, you're going to have to pull the fire control unit out of the controller itself. So the whole controller, of course, is held in, or the fire control unit is held in by these two pins. One on the front, one towards the rear, that need to be just pushed out to take the entire fire control unit out of the pistol to access the trigger, the sear spring, and the trigger return spring in order to do any sort of functional upgrades or modifications to them. So first we're going to pull the rear pin out, and once you push it out, and the pins are the same size diameter, so it doesn't really matter which one comes out where and how they go back in, because fortunately they are the same size. Front one's a little tighter, and once that one's pushed out, now the entire FCU itself slides right out of your controller. Okay, now that we've got the fire control unit itself removed from our ACE controller, we've got one more pin that we need to access. That pin, of course, is this center hinge pin here. That center hinge pin is what the trigger itself hinges on. So we need to push that pin out, and you can use the exact same roll pin punch that we use for the others. This pin doesn't need to come all the way out, but it does need to come out far enough to free up the trigger assembly so that the trigger itself can be removed from the fire control unit. And this is really the only other moving parts in the entire system. So the trigger itself, of course, we got the trigger shoe, and we've got the actuation arm. That actuation arm is, of course, what contacts inside the ACE, or not inside the ACE controller, inside the fire control unit, what we call a transfer bar. And that transfer bar is what then transfers energy to your actual meta controller to actuate the gun in the game, okay? So there's a spring that actually comes out of that side too that sits inside of a cup that rests right inside the housing of the FCU. And it sits in there just like so. Okay, that spring you're going to want to remove. When you remove that spring, this spring is just a coil spring, and it is, of course, then the same size also as the coil spring for your actual sear. And your sear, in this case, is this small white leverage arm here. You don't need to remove it. We're not replacing it or anything. All we're going to do is we're actually going to cut a slightly different face on the surface of this sear right at this area here. So what gives the trigger its feel is as the sear is installed and the trigger is installed inside of your FCU, the FCU has got this other pin most forward in the FCU, and that pin is what your sear contacts. So when the trigger sits inside like this and hinges, when the trigger hinges, every time that you press the trigger, the sear comes down and the face of that sear actually contacts the pin, just similar to how it kind of rubs and breaks across the surface of my roll pin punch. What we want to do is we want to recontour and just take the sharp edge off of that sear, and we're going to do that with a small flat file. I like to use a small flat end diamond file, something like this, and you're just going to take that file, and with that file you're just going to cut and take about 2 to 3 passes just to soften the edge of that sear. And softening the edge of that sear is going to dramatically change the feel of the trigger once everything is reinstalled. Now, I told you we have 2 springs. We've got the trigger return spring that sits inside this cup in the FCU. There is also a sear spring that sits inside your trigger assembly. And mine's got a little bit of oil in it. It kind of holds it in place. But these 2 springs are, again, the same size. So it doesn't really matter which one goes back in where. They're both flat-sided springs. Now, I did take a pair of pliers, and with a pair of pliers or vice grips, I did compress and actually over-compress both of these springs to take a little bit of tension out of the springs, also to improve both trigger feel as well as trigger return on the sear face as well as the trigger assembly itself. So once you've compressed both these springs and taken a little bit of tension out of those, and you have refaced, again, just the surface here on the face of the sear, you're ready to put it all back together. So I do know also maintenance-wise, this trigger assembly does need from time to time to be cleaned, wiped down, and lubricated. And for lubrication, a lot of guys talk about either using maybe a little WD-40. I've tried that. It's just plastic on plastic. Actually, I've had the best success using just kind of standard gun lube. And for the gun lube that I use just standard Lucas heavy duty extreme gun oil, and I'll put a drop on the trigger hinge. I'll run a drop on both sides of the sear. And then simply just take a finger and wipe a little bit of lubricant across the face of the sear, both sides of the sear, just so it hinges best on its own. You'll drop your trigger return spring back in the trigger housing, and everything just sets just the exact same way. We'll take the other spring and we'll put it right back in your FCU housing. And when it's in the FCU housing, now I will take one drop of oil and put it on the transfer bar so that the contact between the leveraging arm on the trigger to the transfer bar, they're lubricated as well. Everything else then just goes right back together in reverse order of assembly. All right, and then once you get the pin reinstalled back in your trigger assembly, you're gonna test the function of the trigger itself. Now you can use a trigger weight gauge and really fine tune and play with this. The standard trigger actuation weight on the FCU when I first started with it was just a touch over 4 pounds. With the modification to the sear face, as well as kind of lubricating all the lubrication spots or contact points on it and softening up those springs a little bit, I was able to get the spring or get the trigger pull weight down in my FCU down to just a touch over 2 pounds. It's nice and firm with very, very little take up, and the trigger brake is just unbelievable. It also, doing a trigger job on your FCU, keeps the meta controller itself from starting to jump around. I'm sure many of you probably noticed when you just hook up the system to begin with that if you really got to kind of play around with the trigger actuation numbers in the game or the settings in the system in order to kind of keep the controller itself or in the game itself from jumping around. So in order to kind of soften that blow on that, that's why doing a trigger job on your FCU, I don't want to say is a necessity, but it sure makes it nice. The game system now, I've probably got well over 150,000 trigger presses on this trigger job on this FCU, and it has been absolutely rock solid. I've not had to do anything other than pull it apart about every 50,000 pulls or so, wipe it down, add a touch more lubricant to all the contact points, and put it back together. But anyhow, that is how we do a trigger job on the ACE system. Once you drop the FCU controller or FCU back into the controller, you just take your 2 pins again, and again, they can go right back in either the same spot or into either spot as far as your front and rear holes. And once they are tapped into place, just like so, you're ready to start playing ACE again.